This may initially seem like merely another sensational Trump headline detailing yet another outlandish demand, but for Britain, this particular strategic maneuver possesses the potential to quietly but profoundly reshape the foundational economic relationship that has underpinned British prosperity for generations. When Donald Trump threatened 8 European allies, including the United Kingdom, with a schedule of rapidly escalating tariffs unless they acquiesced to his bid to purchase Greenland, the majority of observers understandably focused on the sheer theatrical absurdity of the proposition. However, what they largely failed to perceive was the significant institutional earthquake occurring just beneath the surface. The immediate narrative appears straightforward enough. Trump announced the imposition of 10% tariffs on British goods effective February 1st, rising steeply to 25% by June unless European leaders facilitate his acquisition of Greenland. The demand itself seems almost comically imperial in nature, a 21st century president attempting to purchase sovereign territory as if nations were merely assets in a real estate portfolio. European leaders responded with predictable and justified indignation, with the European Parliament moving to freeze its trade deal with Washington and diplomatic protests following the familiar script of international outrage. But this surface-level narrative obscures something far more consequential and dangerous for British economic interests. The threatened tariffs could cost UK businesses somewhere between £6 and £15 billion, according to detailed analysis from the British Chambers of Commerce. These are not abstract diplomatic gestures or rhetorical flourishes. They represent a direct and potent assault on the commercial relationships that employ millions of British workers and sustain entire regional economies across the United Kingdom. The specific mechanics of how this economic damage would unfold deserve a much closer and more rigorous examination. British exporters would immediately face significant cost disadvantages that would compound aggressively through entire supply chains. A manufacturer located in Birmingham producing automotive components for American assembly plants would see their products become 25% more expensive virtually overnight, not because of any quality issues or prevailing market conditions, but entirely because of presidential pique regarding Arctic territory. These companies would face impossible choices: absorb costs that would destroy their profitability, raise prices that would eliminate their competitiveness, or abandon markets they have spent decades painstakingly developing. The ripple effects of this disruption would extend throughout British economic geography in ways that reveal just how deeply integrated transatlantic commerce has truly become. Port cities like Liverpool and Southampton, which handle vast amounts of American-bound cargo, would see shipping volumes decline precipitously as exporters seek alternative markets or abandon their expansion plans entirely. The knock-on effects would hit logistics companies, freight handlers, insurance providers, and the broader service economy that has grown around predictable trade flows. What makes this moment particularly revealing is how it starkly exposes the fragility of the assumptions that have guided British policy for decades. Since the conclusion of the Second World War, Britain has operated on the firm premise that the Atlantic Partnership provided both essential security and economic stability. The so-called special relationship wasn't just diplomatic rhetoric. It was an economic foundation that allowed British businesses to plan, invest, and grow with confidence in predictable American market access. Here is the part that most people miss. Trump's Greenland ultimatum isn't really about Arctic real estate or strategic positioning. It is a stress test of whether America's closest allies will subordinate their sovereignty to presidential whims. The institutional logic at play is brutally clear. Comply with demands that have no rational basis or face economic punishment that could destabilize your domestic economy. For Britain, this creates a precedent that extends far beyond the current crisis. If the United States can weaponize trade relationships to extract compliance on issues entirely unrelated to commerce, then no British economic interest remains secure from political caprice. Today it is Greenland. Tomorrow it could be British financial regulations, immigration policies, or climate commitments that trigger similar ultimatums. The historical parallel here is instructive. During the Suez Crisis of 1956, American economic pressure forced Britain to abandon a military adventure that Washington opposed, but that pressure operated through established institutional channels and addressed directly related policy objectives. Trump's approach dispenses with institutional mediation entirely and connects economic punishment to demands that have no logical relationship to the threatened sanctions. This represents a qualitative shift in how American power operates within the Atlantic Alliance. Traditional economic diplomacy involved negotiations over trade terms, market access, and regulatory coordination issues where economic tools served related economic objectives. What we are witnessing now is the conversion of commercial relationships into instruments of general political coercion applicable to any demand an American president chooses to make. The response from British business leaders has been notably sharp, with many describing Trump's approach as nothing short of economic blackmail. This language matters because it signals a clear recognition that traditional diplomatic protocols may no longer provide adequate protection for British commercial interests. When business communities start using the vocabulary of coercion rather than negotiation, it indicates a fundamental shift in how they perceive the reliability of the American partnership. The timing amplifies these concerns significantly. Britain is still adjusting to post-Brexit trading relationships, seeking to diversify beyond European markets while maintaining crucial transatlantic ties. Trump's tariff threats arrive precisely when Britain needs predictable American market access to validate its independent economic strategy. Instead, British exporters face the prospect of punitive duties that could make their products uncompetitive in their second-largest export market. The Brexit dimension adds a layer of strategic vulnerability that compounds the immediate economic threat. Having left the European Union partly to gain control over trade relationships, Britain now finds itself more exposed to American economic coercion, not less. The European Union, despite its own challenges with Trump's demands, at least offers the collective bargaining power of a massive continental market. Britain faces these pressures as an isolated middle power with limited retaliatory options. This isolation becomes particularly problematic when considering Britain's response options. The European Union can credibly threaten counter-tariffs on €93 billion worth of American goods, ranging from Boeing aircraft to Harley-Davidson motorcycles. Britain's retaliatory capacity, while not insignificant, operates at a much smaller scale and risks triggering escalatory cycles that could devastate British export industries. This is where the story becomes a problem for Britain in ways that extend far beyond immediate commercial damage. The European Parliament's decision to freeze its trade agreement with the United States reflects a broader recalibration of how America's allies assess the value of economic integration with Washington. When multilateral institutions start treating American trade commitments as unreliable, it forces individual nations like Britain to hedge their economic strategies accordingly. The institutional implications ripple outward from this central dynamic. British policymakers must now factor presidential volatility into long-term economic planning in ways that would have seemed unnecessary even 5 years ago. Investment decisions that once assumed stable transatlantic commercial frameworks now require contingency planning for sudden policy reversals driven by unrelated political objectives. Consider how this affects British industries with significant American exposure. Aerospace, pharmaceuticals, financial services, and advanced manufacturing all depend on seamless transatlantic commerce. The threatened tariffs don't just impose immediate costs, they introduce uncertainty that makes long-term strategic planning exponentially more difficult. Companies cannot invest confidently when market access depends on compliance with demands that have nothing to do with commercial considerations. The pharmaceutical sector offers a particularly stark example. British companies have built research and development strategies around assumed American market access, investing billions in facilities and clinical trials designed for transatlantic distribution. Trump's willingness to weaponize trade relationships for geopolitical objectives forces these companies to question whether their American strategies remain viable. Financial services face similar recalculations. London's role as a global financial center depends partly on its ability to serve American clients and access American capital markets. When trade relationships become subject to presidential demands about Arctic territory, financial institutions must wonder what other non-commercial factors might suddenly threaten their American operations. The reputational dimension cannot be ignored either. London has marketed itself as a stable, predictable jurisdiction for international business, distinguishing British commercial law and regulatory frameworks from more volatile alternatives. But this competitive advantage erodes when Britain's own market access becomes subject to American political volatility that British authorities cannot control or predict. Here is what concerns me most about this pattern. The institutional damage extends beyond the immediate tariff threat because it demonstrates how quickly decades of economic integration can become hostage to political impulses. Even if the Greenland ultimatum eventually fades, the precedent remains that American market access is conditional on compliance with demands that bear no relationship to commercial logic. This dynamic puts British leadership in an impossible position. Capitulating to obviously unreasonable demands legitimizes the use of economic coercion to extract political compliance, but resisting risks genuine economic damage that affects British workers, businesses, and communities that never signed up for a geopolitical confrontation. The response from other European allies has been notably unified, with 8 nations issuing a joint statement rejecting both the tariff threats and the underlying demand for Greenland. This coordination matters because it demonstrates that America's closest allies are beginning to treat presidential demands as institutional challenges rather than diplomatic negotiations. When Democratic allies start coordinating resistance to American economic pressure, it signals a fundamental shift in how they perceive the reliability of American leadership. The Supreme Court ruling on Trump's emergency economic powers could provide temporary relief if it constrains his ability to impose tariffs through executive action, but even a favorable legal outcome wouldn't address the deeper institutional problem. An American presidency that treats economic relationships with Democratic allies as tools for extracting compliance rather than foundations for mutual prosperity. The legal questions surrounding Trump's use of emergency economic powers reveal another dimension of institutional breakdown. The International Emergency Economic Powers Act was designed to address genuine national security threats, not to extract compliance on issues like territorial acquisition. When emergency authorities become routine tools of economic coercion, the distinction between legitimate security measures and arbitrary presidential power disappears. For British observers, this moment illuminates how vulnerable their economy remains to American political dysfunction even after Brexit was supposed to provide greater sovereignty over commercial relationships. The cruel irony is that leaving the European Union to gain control over trade policies has left Britain more exposed to American economic coercion, not less. The broader implications extend to Britain's position in the global economy. As other nations observe American willingness to weaponize trade relationships against democratic allies, they inevitably adjust their own strategies to reduce dependence on American markets and institutions. This gradual decoupling doesn't announce itself with dramatic headlines, but it reshapes the architecture of international commerce in ways that could leave Britain stranded between an increasingly unreliable American partner and a European bloc it chose to leave. The real question for Britain isn't what Trump wants regarding Greenland. It is whether British economic strategy can remain dependent on partnerships that have become hostage to presidential impulses that bear no relationship to British interests or democratic governance.